Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Islam and Modern Philosophy. Today I want to talk about the topic of personal identity. So that is the part dealing with what are we consistent of, or we could say what part of us persists over time. So that is really the problem here, trying to define the self, the human self. The reason I bring this up is because I think there's a huge dichotomy or difference between how, let's say, old people used to perceive the self and how modern thinkers perceive the self. Now, of course, we cannot say all modern philosophers or all modern thinkers because there is obviously a difference of opinion. But I believe one of the big or great philosophers of modern times who basically created this issue or created this dichotomy is, of course, a famous philosopher by the name of David Hume. Now, in the case of David Hume, when he talked about human nature, he made a huge departure from the definition of the self as was, perceived and talked about in monotheistic religions, and also as it was discussed in Greek philosophy, for example. So if you examine all of the old philosophies of the Greeks and other civilizations, and also if you examine the revealed books, including, of course, the Quran, the final revealed book, you see that there's a very, concise definition of the self. In the case of Islam, and I'll talk about Islam because this is the religion I studied and I understand much more than other older civilizations or theologies. In the case of Islam, the definition of the self is really a combination of the body and the soul. Now, again, in other older philosophies, you might see that the self is defined as the soul or just the soul, because the body does not persist, right? But I believe in Islam, it goes even further, and the real definition of the self is a combination of the body and the soul, and I'll tell you why. But before that, let me explain a little bit why this is a problem to begin with. Well, if I can ask you, what really makes you persistent across time? You might say, well, my body, I carry my body from the time I'm born until I die. But this is not completely true because our body goes through lots of changes. And like the molecules or the particles you had in your body when you're born are long gone by the time you're 40 or 50. So our body goes through a lot of changes. And you cannot argue that it is the same exact body that you have across time. And some people give a nice example of, let's say, a car. So you might say, I have a car. This is my car. And you might attach an identity to this car. But think about it. What makes it a car, or what makes it the car you think it is your car? Well, it could be, for example, the body of the car. But the body changes. You might change the wheels or the tires. You might, paint the car in a different, color, and so on. So after a while, and you keep, introducing those changes, after a while, this car may no longer be your car or look like your car, right? So there is a problem there, that we have to identify something so essential in an object and make that the identity of that object. And that's not an easy problem to solve. Now, if we look at modern philosophers, let's say before David Hume, or not as drastic as David Hume, John Locke, for example. So John Locke is kind of in between, because on one hand he's an empiricist like David Hume, and as you know, empiricism as a school relies a lot on sensations. So to them, there is no innate knowledge. You don't have any a priori knowledge. All the knowledge we gather is from experience. And this goes into epistemology. That's another episode, inshallah. But the point is, there is some similarities between David Hume and John Locke. However, John Locke says about the self, he identifies or defines the self as this unbroken chain of memories that you have. And that's something really interesting, because that's one way to identify the self. I'm the only one who could recognize all the memories I had in the past, right? So this chain of memory. And again, because he's an empiricist, he's going to appeal to experiences. So he's basically saying all these experiences, those unique experiences you've had in the past, and the memory of those is basically who you are. And obviously, each one of us has a different set of experiences and so on. But Hume goes farther. Hume talks about what he calls impressions. So really the self is made of those impressions. Impressions are not really continuous, like, Locke's memory chain. So it could be those fragmented, interrupted or disrupted impressions. So every day I might have different impressions, and maybe the sum of those impressions is what I am, is the definition of the self. This is very problematic, obviously, because this goes directly against the concept of the immutable soul, because that's the definition of a soul. And hence, if what we are, if our identity is nothing but those impressions, then obviously there's nothing left of us when we die. And hence, there is no existence of the self after death. And I think this is what Hume was aiming at, because he does not believe in the soul, and he does not believe in a life after death. This is really important to understand, and maybe again, this is an extreme of where people can go in defining the self. And it's important to understand vis-a-vis or against our understanding of the self. Now, let me come back to Islam. I said that I believe in Islam, the self is defined as body and soul. And the reason I say that is because we believe that death is the separation. All right? It is the separation of the body and soul. But remember, in Islam, and maybe only in Islam, we have the concept of resurrection. And this resurrection happens to the body and soul. So we believe that all our parts, everything that has decomposed into the earth will be gathered by Allah, by God. It'll be put back into a body. Now, yes, there are some narrations that says the body will not be exactly the same. It might be a different shape. But the idea exists that we will be reassembled. So even the body persists. It's not just the soul. And then the soul will rejoin the body. All right? So it seems that, and that's my understanding, that in Islam, the self is defined as the body and soul. And yes, of course, the body goes through some, transformations, if you will, or some changes. But at the end, there is something material. It may not be the exact same body, but it is something material along with the soul. It's not just a soul. And I think that is maybe the most comprehensive understanding of what a self is in Islam. If you look at it holistically, there's always a combination, a marriage, if you will, between the body and soul. And someone at the end, someone might ask, well, how do we know which one is right, which one is wrong? And this is not just to rely on belief, right? Because obviously in Islam we believe in it, right? But is there a way logically to explain or to convince even someone of your perception? Well, if we were to take the materialistic conception, because a lot of times Hume is either implicitly or explicitly driving toward this total materialistic conception of the world. And he does it in such tricky ways sometimes. He's a very clever person. But the question at the end of the day, so let us assume that Hume's view is correct, that there's nothing to us, nothing to ourself or our identity except the body, or except the materialistic aspect. And in his case, like the senses and what they perceive and the impressions, and that's it. Even if we don't appeal to logic, just the way we feel. I mean, I think all of us recognize that there is to us, or there's more to us than just the body. Obviously, if you just live life and examine and have an open eye, like Socrates says all the time, that you have to always have an you have to have examination and observation. You have to observe around. You have to be paying attention and make notice of things. You notice that there's much more to us than just the body. All right? And there's no doubt something out there more than just the objective or the materialistic existence. The fact that we have feelings, we have emotions, we have consciousness. I mean, no one can explain consciousness up till now. I mean, there's so many books on consciousness, but no one has a clue even what consciousness is. We have the subjective experience, what philosophers called the qualia, like our experience of everything around us, of colors, for example, the experience of redness and blueness. This is totally separate from the objective reality of the fact that there is a color called blue with a certain wavelength. Our subjective experience, how do we explain all of that? If it's just a matter, if it's just the neurons in your brain, how do we explain all of the other dimensions? So there has to be some other being. I mean, we call it a soul. You might call it, consciousness in a modern language. Maybe if you lived in the times of Descartes, he might have called it a mind, right? So there might be different vocabulary used to represent one thing or to point to one thing, which is all that we cannot explain other than the body. And by the way, the Quran says that. The famous ayah in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. When they ask you about the soul, say the soul is a matter of the unseen. It's a matter of the divine. It's incomprehensible because it is immaterial. It's really hard to comprehend something that is not material, that we cannot sense. It's beyond our senses. It's beyond empiricism altogether, right? And then the verse said, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. Remember and remind yourself, you've only given a little of knowledge. So this is beyond us, and we just have to be satisfied with that. And this is where I'll end. I hope I gave a bit of justice to the concept of the self, the concept of personal identity, which is related to human nature, a big topic in philosophy. And I hope I gave justice to both the, let's say, the materialistic, or the concept as it existed among empiricists versus as it exists among religious people or people who believe in revealed religions, and specifically how we Muslims also look at this particular topic, the topic of personal identity, how we persist over time. Thank you very much for listening, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.